Um, I know several of my students are joining us, and from last night's first class of the semester, they asked a bunch of difficult questions, which I said to save and ask our guest speaker. Well, we have an exciting program ahead on India's domestic politics and the democratic reckoning, with someone who, in my mind, is easily India's best public intellectual of his generation, Professor Pratap Bhanu Mehta. A very special welcome to you, Pratap, and a personal thanks to you for joining me today. Before turning to our program, I need to take care of a couple of housekeeping matters. First of all, I want to remind you that this event is on the record and it will be recorded via the Sigur Center's YouTube channel. You can ask questions right through the program, and there will be staff that are collecting the questions. Make sure to put your questions in the Q&A box, not in the chat box, please. And don't wait till the last minute. I think we've got a packed crowd and just an hour, so I can't promise I'll get to every one of you if you wait too long. When you do submit the questions, make sure to state your name and your affiliation and keep the questions concise. The format is that our speaker, Pratap, will speak for about 20 minutes. I will then have a Q&A with him, a conversation with him for about 10 to 15 minutes, and then turn it over for audience questions. So with that, let me begin by saying what an absolute privilege it is for me to host Pratap Bhanu Mehta as the inaugural speaker of our 2021 Sigur Center Lecture Series. The idea of our lecture series is to draw attention to timely and pressing issues, broadly speaking, in Asia, and analyze them through innovative and original thinking. And for those of us who know Pratap, know that he is the quintessential original thinker, from Indian politics, to international politics, to highly academic, intricate political theory. I began reading Pratap way back in 1998, right after the Indian nuclear test, when I happened to run across a short piece he did in the Harvard Alumni Magazine, by him on Indian nuclear tests. And I thought that was the best thing I had read on the subject. And so let me just say I haven't stopped reading him since. Pratap is currently a professor of political science at Ashoka University, where before that he was the Vice-Chancellor, the first Vice-Chancellor, taking the 5-year-old university to a highly ranked status in no time at all. And he did the same thing at the Center for Policy Research, where he was president, elevating it to new highs. And now, throughout all this institution building, Pratap has been a prolific scholar and commentator. And over the last few years, you can read him regularly on most days in the Indian Express as a commentator with his column there. I never miss his Indian Express column, no matter what topic it is on. I always learn something. And if there's a tough question happening, I always wait for him to give his take. Now, I'm not going to go over all his honors and other illustrious accomplishments simply because the list is too long and it will detain us from getting to his talk. And that brings me to his talk today. I've given Pratap a huge topic. I'm literally asking him to do a kind of a democracy audit of sorts for India. And obviously, it's an extraordinarily complex and difficult subject. But one thing about Pratap's work is that he is one of the few scholars in political science these days who asks the big questions, the tough questions, and takes them head on and comes up with a very incisive analysis. I could have substituted the US for India in the title of the talk today, and I'm sure he would have handled it just as expertly. So Pratap 2020 began with huge protests in India against the Citizenship Amendment Act, and 2021 started with a huge marathon farmers' protest. If a Martian had landed in Delhi in early 2020 and returned in early 2021, and by the way, who can rule out that possibility given everything else that we have seen these days? They might have concluded that Indian democracy is thriving. But we Earthlings know that that's not the case. So with that, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Deepa, for that extraordinarily generous introduction. And it's a real privilege to be speaking at the Sigur seminar. It's such a wonderful and distinguished, I think, DC institution. So the topic that I've been given is very, very wide. And what I thought I'd do in the next 10 to 15 odd minutes is maybe try and just lay out a framework of how we think about Indian democracy at this moment. I'll make some propositions about how we describe what is going on, and then a couple of speculative suggestions about what course Indian politics might take in the near future. Now, one of the challenges of our times, I think, and as political scientists, political theorists, we feel it, I think, quite insistently, is that much of the conceptual vocabulary in which we used to describe our political world seems to break down when we look at recent events. I know the US is having a debate over whether the events at the Capitol was an insurrection, a storming, a salvo in a civil war, an attempted coup d'etat. Are right-wing forces best described as fascist, populist, racist, something else, some combination of these? And of course, as scholars, we debate these nuances all the time. I think the challenge in thinking about Indian democracy is somewhat similar. There is no question that India is still a vigorous electoral democracy with very high levels of political participation by any measure of participation, voting, political activity, and so forth. There has been no serious contesting of election results yet. The constitutional form that we are used to still exists: parliament, courts, auditing institutions, Reserve Bank, the whole shebang, the whole set of institutions that you associate with a liberal democracy. But underneath, there are tectonic shifts that seem to be taking place in the regime type. And the first point I want to emphasize that the shifts that we are seeing are not just political shifts. What do I mean by a political shift? A political shift is basically a shift where, one political party gives way to another. Many political scientists like Milan Vaishnav and so forth have argued that, for example, India is now in its fourth party system, where the BJP has become the nationally dominant party by every measure of national dominance, right? The number of state governments it controls, its share of the electoral vote, its presence across the country, and so forth. That shift is, I think, quite familiar to us. But what I think is less familiar to us is that this political shift is being accompanied by almost a shift in regime type. And one way of sort of, expressing this shift, just by way of anecdote, a few years ago, I co-edited the Oxford Handbook to the Indian Constitution, a big reference work. And I honestly have to say that when I go into classroom and try and teach the Indian Constitution today, I cannot tell my students with a straight face what the Indian Constitution is or what they can expect of it. That's how big this shift in regime type is. There are 5 principal elements to this shift. This new regime constellation, you might say, emerging, 5 elements of this constellation. Many of these elements have been there previously in Indian politics, in Indian history, but these 5 are now coming together, I think, in a new configuration that marks a fundamental departure from what we used to think of as the Indian constitutional or political structure. So the first element, very straightforwardly, is of course, India is well on its way, if it already has not become a Hindu majoritarian nation. Hindu majoritarianism is being inscribed in law. So that's the most important thing. It's not just a political tendency, it's being inscribed in law. A few examples, the Citizenship Amendment Act that Deepa talked about, which for the first time, in some senses, aligned pathways to citizenship for refugees with religion, is one example of that. State after state is passing, have been passing laws regulating conversion from one religion to other more and more, in some cases with a view of deterring religious intermarriage. New laws for cow protection, but ones that also empower vigilantes to take action on behalf of that law. One such law has just been passed in Karnataka. These are just some examples of the way in which Hindu nationalism is being inscribed in law and will continue to be inscribed in law. But Hindu nationalism is not just being inscribed in law, it has become the dominant current of politics. And in one sentence, if one can describe it as a current in politics, the BJP often likes to say, with characteristic exaggeration, that in the previous Indian regimes, the minorities had veto over substantial number of issues in Indian politics. We are basically going to make minorities completely irrelevant to politics. So the idea is, in a sense, to marginalize, politically marginalize minorities. Hindu nationalism is becoming the texture of civil society. There's a vast reconfiguration of civil society underway. The RSS, for example, has managed to quite successfully and in some senses quite stunningly almost create a parallel historical epistemological world without much resistance. And all of these inscriptions of Hindu nationalism in law, in politics, and civil society are working towards the symbolic, material, and political consolidation of Hindu power. So is India now an ethnocracy, as it were? Not the palimpsest on which every civilization has written its history. It's a Hindu majoritarian nation, very palpable. The second big shift is the shift towards authoritarianism. Now, of course, Indian democracy has been subject to authoritarian episodes before, most notably during the emergency in 1975 to 1977. And of course, state power has been used in authoritarian ways episodically. And one has to say, for example, that this government did not have to pass too many new laws to empower the executive to act in an authoritarian way. So, for example, laws on sedition, the misuse of anti-terror laws, that legal structure has, in a sense, been very much part of Indian democracy. But what you are seeing now is, I think, quite a dramatic escalation and consolidation of an authoritarian mode of governance. One indicator of this fact is that if you look at the VDEM indicators, right, this database out of Sweden, I understand you have to take these databases with a pinch of salt, but they do give some sense of change. India's indicators on liberty, civil liberties, now look like what they were in 1975, right? Last time India had a formally declared emergency. And one can give lots and lots of, in some senses, indications of this. Almost every single independent institution that was supposed to act as a check and balance on the executive, including the Supreme Court of India, has been more or less decimated. I mean, there's the collapse of the higher Indian judiciary, particularly the Supreme Court, is perhaps one of the most stunning and depressing developments in Indian governance. We can talk more about this in discussion, but broadly speaking, the state is veering towards authoritarianism. So India's had communalism in the past. majoritarianism, it's had authoritarianism. Now the two are coming together. The third, I think, increasing shift is there is an increasing vigilantization of civil society. I think the equivalent would be sort of what in the US terms is called the kind of militarization of civil society. Of course, Indian civil society has, again, episodically been marked by violence in the past. Institutionalized rights systems in the 1960s, caste violence, just to name two examples. But what is, I think, unprecedented about this moment is the open advocacy, dog whistling, and protection of vigilantism that happens in civil society. In fact, you might say that if you want a political career in India right now, one of the surest ways of making a political career is to, in a sense, show your prowess at exercising that kind of vigilantism on behalf of Hindu nationalism in civil society at large. And one of the consequences of this, again, you'll see the parallels with the US. Politics is no longer the competition between citizens, peacefully jostling for power under settled rules. It really has become, in a sense, a contest between friend and enemy, where the ruling dispensation more or less regards any serious expression of dissent as anti-national. So vigilantism has becoming an empowering path to politics. And if you go down the leadership one level down from Prime Minister Modi, pretty much every political leader that is on the rise, Yogi Adityanath in UP, for example, has a demonstrated record in that form of vigilantism. The fourth element is the weakening of federalism. Compared to the United States, India, of course, always had a much weaker system of federalism. The center was, by constitutional design, much stronger than it is in the United States. The states don't technically have an independent political identity. They can be made and remade. Indian federalism worked very well to knit together India's diversity, particularly on the linguistic issue. And I think on the linguistic issue, one still expects Indian federalism to hold. I think the BJP has very cleverly realized that's not an issue on which to push too many electoral buttons. But almost on every other dimension of federalism, administrative, fiscal, constitutional, or political, India is becoming a more centralized country. As the joke goes around these days, India is one nation, one everything, right? And the last and final dimension is there is an unprecedented control being exercised by government. This is one manifestation of authoritarianism, but excessive control over both capital and control over the information order. I mean, the Indian private capital has always been at the mercy of the state in one way or the other. But I think now it is being enlisted in an ideological project of Hindu majoritarianism in a way that is absolutely unprecedented. And one simple example of this is, in a sense, the way in which the state uses its power to control capital, to be able to control as much of the information order it can, particularly television media, particularly regulatory influence of social media, and so forth. I mean, it's really putting in place all those elements. So if you put all of this stuff together, right, what do you call India? Right? These are all elements of classic authoritarian, if you don't want to use the word neo-fascist, but certainly deeply authoritarian regime. So, and I don't think one should underestimate that this is the direction in which Indian democracy seems to be heading, with popular acclaim and popular approval. Now, why has this happened? And I'll just be very brief on this. I mean, just kind of quickly lay down 3 or 4 points for us to think about in discussion. it's a long story why we came to this pass, why the BJP's electoral hold continues to deepen, and I think will continue to deepen over the course of the next couple of years. Part of the story is, of course, that regime change of this kind happens when the old regime implodes from the top. And the self-serving, plutocratic, indecisive structures of the Congress party, even 6 years after defeat, have not, in a sense, do not have any will to fight left. Let's put it this way. There is no effective national opposition left. That's one sense in which India is quite different from the US. You could also argue, in all fairness, that one of the things BJP capitalized on was the fact that post-1947, certainly post-1950, the creation of the Indian Republic and the promulgation of the Indian Constitution, there were a whole series of issues that, in a sense, we had put in deep freeze, right? Relatively speaking. One of the principal issues, for example, being, just to take an example, let's say the issue of what regimes of personal law should govern India. Each community has their own set of personal laws. Are these personal laws compatible with the requirement of the formal requirements of liberty and equality that modern constitutionalism requires? And one of the extraordinary things that the BJP has managed to do is it has actually managed to occupy even that space of progressive politics, right, which you thought the center or left would have. But I think, having said all of this, having sort of conceded there is some truth to the fact that the old regime had become, you might say, corrupt and frozen in its ideological thinking, the two most important, I think, developments that facilitate the rise of BJP and which will continue to accelerate are the following. We always used to say that Indian democracy is characterized by a centrism, right? The joke used to be whichever party rules India is going to look like the Congress party. The Rudolphs had this famous thesis of the kind of the deep centrism of Indian politics. Why has that centrism crumbled? One of the big underlying social forces that has led to the crumbling of that centrism is the fact that we always used to assume that India has lots of cross-cutting cleavages that would act as a natural social check on the consolidation of power, right? The distribution of power in society between different castes, between different regions, different religions, languages, all these cross-cutting cleavages, right, would make it nearly impossible for any single cleavage or any single ideology to dominate Indian politics. The only way you could come to power in Indian politics was through a kind of act of synthesis in some senses, right? India is a federation of communities. You knit all of these cross cleavages together, which was basically the Congress model, or at least that's how it was supposed to work. I think one of the most interesting developments, I think, in Indian politics is that partly as a result of economic progress, but partly for other sociological reasons, these natural, what we used to think of as natural cross-cutting cleavages, no longer quite have the same power in Indian politics they used to. So I'll just take one example. Caste, for example. Caste still matters for Indian politics. I'm not going to deny that proposition. And certainly caste matters in lots of ways. It still determines your life chances. It's still a basis of horrendous discrimination. But in the last 25, 30 years, particularly post-1991, caste was supposed to have acted as a brake on Hindu nationalism, right? Because the logic of caste mobilization was agglomerative. Smaller and smaller caste groupings were, in a sense, converging around larger social movements. So take Dalits in North India, for example, the Bahujan Samaj Party, which managed to consolidate lots of Dalit subcaste groups into a new Dalit identity. And it was that agglomerative logic that allowed it to, let's say, capture 20% of the vote and in some senses act as a natural check on the consolidation of power, right? One of the, I think, remarkable things that is happening in Indian politics is that the logic of caste is now, instead of agglomerating, it's de-agglomerating. Partly because of inequalities within these larger agglomerations, right? They don't have naturally aligned political interests. Partly because of economic development, this is something we can talk about. The nature of voting has become a little bit more individualized in some ways. So when the Yadav vote in a state like Uttar Pradesh splits 2 ways or 3 ways, you aren't quite sure anymore, right, what the logic of caste mobilization means. And so what that means is that the natural social cleavages, which pretty much all previous coalitions relied on to counterbalance and check the consolidation of Hindu nationalism, no longer exist. The one thing the BJP is absolutely brilliant about, and I think right-wing movements generally have been brilliant about, even if you don't like them, you have to acknowledge this political fact. They also have a much more generative view of identity, which is the idea that identities are in part the creation of political movements. They are not naturally sociologically given. In that sense, they're much more constructivist, I think, than the left and the center in Indian politics are. And the cultural work of the production of new identities that the BJP has been carrying out, the RSS is one of the largest civil society organizations in the world. It's managed to create almost a kind of second reality, as it were, right? That work of mobilization, outreach, consolidation, penetrating civil society, changing the ideational structure, right? That actually political activity can create new configurations. The right has an absolutely unprecedented advantage in this over the left and center in India. I think the left and center was in a grip of a certain kind of sociological determinism, right? Okay. And so what that means is, if any political formation is going to have to counter the BJP, it'll have to, in a sense, do that generative work of politics almost on a national scale from scratch, right? It can't take natural social divisions for granted as a basis for mobilizing against the BJP. But the vehicles for doing that kind of political mobilization, particularly political parties, have, for exogenous reasons, almost collapsed. The Congress party, for example, just to take one example, the most dominant one. But it is also true of several other parties like the SP, in some senses, and the BSP, right? So given the fact that politics has got more mediatized, it will require almost national scale political mobilization. Given the fact that the BJP successfully manages to control both Indian capital and the information order, the entry barriers now to any opposition mounting a national scale opposition to the BJP are just considerably much higher. And it is for this reason, right, the structural reason, apart from a whole bunch of things, other things, that I think it's going to be very difficult to mount a political challenge to the BJP in the short run. The only circumstance under which that could happen is if there is a severe economic shock to the country. All said and done, I think BJP's economic performance will be quite middling. It won't be as catastrophic as its critics like to claim, nor will be it as spectacular as its defenders like to claim. Prime Minister Modi has also created, I think, a very interesting political economy model, what my friend Arvind Subramaniam calls the private distribution of public goods, which is instead of investing in public goods like health and education, investing in the delivery of a range of goods that are in the short run actually quite important to people and their identities. So for example, think of the distribution of gas to women, an absolute masterstroke, both politically and normatively. Gas, electricity, sanitation, right? It's a model that was first perfected by political parties in the South. And I think the state will continue to give him enough resources to be able to stitch together, I think, an underlying economic coalition that's going to be relatively hard to dislodge, even if the Indian economy does not grow at 8% or 7%. So in short, and just to be provocative is my kind of closing comment, I think the US is looking at the risks of deep partisan contestation almost on the verge of civil war. India, on the other hand, is actually looking at serious authoritarian consolidation on one side. Now, which one is going to be more propitious for democracy is an open question. I'll stop there and look forward to your questions.
Thank you, Pratap, for that masterful explanation and laying out what really are some of the key features that we've all been thinking about, but you've put them all extremely well. And there are so many interesting points here that I scarcely know where to begin. But let me go back to the beginning for a second. And really the notion of Indian democracy and the trends that are undermining it right now, and where we can find some of the flaws. So let me just start by saying that, we all know that Indian democracy was called the Great Indian Experiment at the beginning, and given the enormous odds against it. And so even the worst critics have shown that, that it has actually been consistently, as you point out, for decades, it functioned in a particular way. Now, my question here is, when we look at the flaws here, there are three things that I want to ask. And one is, would you suggest that the great experiment, because if that is what it was, that somehow that itself, fundamentally, the Indian experiment had flaws, and therefore we're just seeing the evolution of that? Or is it that it is actually, we've gone beyond the experiment. Indian democracy has certain institutional structures that are strong, but it is undergoing a similar kind of undermining that we see in post sort of more mature democracies globally. And therefore, there's something different at work here. It's not the Nehruvian model that was the problem, but it's this. And a third one, which I frankly think is, and you alluded to that, is what I think is perhaps needs to look at more carefully, is the regional level, where when you look at South Asia and the majoritarianism that we find in almost all of those countries, literally all of them, the lack of secularism, the weak, unstable secularism, the incomplete state building, the contested, the incomplete, the sort of continuing partition overhang. To me, to understand Indian democracy and its and where we find ourselves, I would suggest that perhaps that level is something that we need to look more at. But clearly they're all interlinked. So I'd like to hear your comment on that.
No, that's a very insightful comment. And I think a couple of thoughts very quickly. I mean, each of those points requires a kind of deeper elaboration. So one, look, I think if we are candid, we have to acknowledge the fact that all democratic experiments, right, even the most mature ones, underneath the surface, there are always reactionary elements carousing, right? Racism in the United States, for example. And Hindu nationalism actually has a long history in India. It's not of recent, in some sense, an invention, as have different kinds of identity-based nationalisms in their reactionary forms, right? I think what is interesting, and I think what has changed is, and what we have done in all our democracies over the last, 50, 70 years, is either find ways of managing it, sometimes at the cost of denying people justice, or we have in some senses found some ways of amelioratively at least improving, right, these underlying conflicts. I think what has changed, and I think, and so to that extent, these, you might say, dark forces that cruise through our democracy will erupt from time to time, right? It's true even of mature democracies. I think what has changed, I think what Trump changed in the United States and what I think the BJP has now changed in India is, I think, a certain level of ideological normalization of what we all understood to be, right? Some of these subterranean currents that we need to learn to manage and, in some senses, hopefully defeat. What was, in a sense, was what was meant to be subterranean, in a sense, has become now normal and centered. And I think it's that normalization, the normalization of vigilantism, the normalization of communalism, even at an ideological level, not just at the level of practice, right? That I think is something that is of more recent vintage, and in a sense is a global phenomenon. I mean, I think Europe is, if you count Hungary and Poland in a sense as part of the EU experiment, is undergoing a version of this. Now, in our case, I think the most important point that you made, which I think does require serious reflection, is the regional dimension. And the simple fact of the matter, I think, is the following, which is post-1947 and then post-1950, there was a settlement in South Asia with the creation of new states. And all those states are now mature, legitimate states. I mean, they're part of the international system. But the terms in which each of those states define their identity, right, was designed to generate continuing conflict in some ways. I mean, Pakistan has not resolved its internal political economy and its identity issues. Certainly Bangladeshi secularism. Bangladesh has done spectacularly well in some other, in development ways, but Bangladeshi secularism is an issue. And the histories of these ideological conflicts in each of our countries is intimately tied to the ideological conflict in our neighbors. Mm-hmm. And in the long run, I cannot see a secular progressive South Asia unless it happens across South Asia simultaneously. I mean, it doesn't mean we sort of undo the settlement of 1940. I mean, that's a reality, and that's probably a good thing. I mean, right? But unless in South Asia we decide that, look, we want this to be a region that protects individual freedom and dignity. We don't want this to be a region where our national identities and our constitutional visions are designed to protect some identities at the expense of others. Unless all of us do it together, right? The pressures in each of our domestic politics is going to, in a sense, continue to increase. So there's no solution to the Kashmir problem, for example, without a simultaneous understanding in Kashmir, in Pakistan, in India, that human rights across the board have to trump, that the pacification of violence is a common value all of us are committed to, right? And so interstate relations in South Asia have more of a character of, a sort of a long drawn out civil and ideological war, which we haven't come to fully come to terms with yet.
Thank you. We have a few more minutes that I want to engage with you on, Pratap. One of the things that you mentioned as countervailing, that could have been a countervailing factor, is, of course, opposition, a strong opposition, whether it be the Congress Party or coalition. Now, what is interesting to see is that even in 2019 elections, the BJP got 37% of the votes, the NDA got 45% of the votes, and yet they're in this extraordinary position of being able to dictate a national transformation, in a sense. And so, the Indian public, the Indian voters have surprised us in the past with social movements that have emerged, the JP movement, the Aam Aadmi Party movement, the corruption movement, these sorts of things. The question is, can India, given its habits in the past of decentralization, of much more political engagement, if there is this move toward consolidation of authoritarianism and a lack of space for political opposition, could that be a spur? I mean, could this experiment by the BJP work so well that it creates its own sort of backlash?
No, that's a very interesting question. So I think two quick thoughts on that. One, of course, that backlash will happen. I mean, it's hard to imagine, right, a political regime consolidating power in this kind of way, and as it were, not making mistakes. I think the CA movement you cited, I think currently the movement we have, the farmers movement, particularly in Punjab, we have. So you are going to get, I think, examples of significant social movements. My worry, I think, is the following, and I think what makes this moment, I think, different, let's say, from even 1975 is the following, right? Which is, one, a lot of these social movements are actually a reflection of the fact that the political opposition is weak. And what this means is that you do not have the usual political channels for the expression of political discontent or even holding out the hope. Remember, the BJP with 2 MPs in parliament could hold up parliament and prevent legislation from passing, right? Now, to my mind, I mean, at one level, these movements are particularly worthy in the way they have elicited at least responses of groups of citizens. But they have 3 inherent limitations. One, they're still confined to the particular constituencies which the BJP's policies has accepted. Let's face it, the CA movement was a nationwide movement, but it did not get enough participation from non-Muslims. I think that's a brute fact we have to accept. I think the farmers movement in Punjab. Punjab has a particular political economy which is driving this movement. This is not a national movement on a significant scale. And to that extent, governments will find a way of managing them through a combination of buyouts, repression, compromises. Second, as I said, because they're a failure, they're a reflection of the failure of the political opposition. There's no pathway by which these movements are actually coalescing into any kind of a political outcome or a political party, or even strengthening the political opposition for that matter. I mean, in fact, arguably the Punjab movement is as much against the Congress as it is, it is against the BJP. And that's actually a worrying situation for politics, because what it means is that if the opposition political channels are in a sense choked up, then you could get into a cycle of, in a sense, social movements, repression, more social movements, in a sense, repression. And so long as elite cohesion in the BJP remains, I mean, this is one thing we do know, right? So long as the ruling regime holds together, doesn't split, it's actually very difficult in India to dislodge. The only way we used to know was through elections. Even the JP movement ultimately had to transform into a political movement and a political party. Otherwise, it would not have been successful. It also depended on Indira Gandhi calling elections. Otherwise, it would not be successful. And I don't see the translation of social movements into political opposition.
Okay. All right. Well, on that dismal note, I'm going to abuse my a privilege here as moderator and ask one more question. This is, as an international relations scholar, I want to just ask one question about the trends in India, the image of India that we're seeing over the past few years. You mentioned the indicators from various institutions abroad looking at Indian democracy, press freedom, so forth, and finding the soft power of India, which had been one of the leading sort of advantages, if you will, power by example in the international system, and the damage that is being done to it is very hard to measure, unlike economics and military. So we tend to kind of dismiss it. But I think it's one of those things that's intangible. We don't know how much we value it until we lose it. And then suddenly it becomes important. And then we recognize it, such as, for example, look at the United States right now and the kind of image, the battering it's taking. And I'll just, from in my own sense, I do think that it matters to some extent, because I'll just give a very quick anecdote. I was in Bangladesh in 2004 for a research on my book. And this was right after the BJP had lost elections and the Congress Party had come back. And I was talking about what kind of confidence building measures Bangladesh and India could do, or could India do. And one of the editors looked at me and said, the elections, the election of a secular government is the most confidence building measure you can get. So it stuck with me, but it points out that, we can't really dismiss that, and to what extent that might redound to a softening of some of these trends in India by the government itself, who is very, very interested in having a good international image.
So I think two things. One, to be honest, I think, in the kind of super muscular nationalist circles, their reading of history is almost the opposite. I mean, I think they're mistaken, but I think part of that argument is that, look, one, the gains from just having soft power are nearly not as high as we tend to think. And I actually agree with you that we don't know what we've lost until we've lost it, right? But I think more importantly, I mean, if I can put the point crudely, I think the view is that if India gets to 7%, 8% growth rate, none of this stuff is going to matter. And they'll be the first to point to just look at the history of Sino-US relations, right? So long as international capital, there's money to be made. Even if you can't crack a joke, if there's money to be made in India, fundamentally that's going to be, in a sense, the driver of that relationship. Yes, there will be a kind of pantomime, surface irritant, an occasional resolution in Congress, occasional reprimand by the MEA. But that is, in a sense, the surface, I think, level of politics. So I think the assessment here is that the big driving forces of international politics, which are, one, the circulation of global capital, and second, at this conjuncture, the rise of China, in some senses, means that the premium on, as it were, soft power has probably diminished. That's how it's actually being read. And that in the end, even the US's options, yes, I mean, there will be, I'm sure, several members of Congress will be upset. House of Commons will occasionally pass a resolution. But fundamentally, the costs of that are not going to be too high. My own sense is, to be honest, that I think the biggest price we are going to pay for the loss of that soft power is in our region itself, which is that, the view that we had that, look, at least India was a sort of stable democracy veering towards a liberal democracy, made South Asia a zone of stability. Now it is, in a sense, going to give an incentive to pretty much every regime and every reactionary, in some senses, to respond. We know also the counter-resistance to authoritarianism and communalism is kind of sub-regionalism, and which also has a communal character of its own kind. So I think the elevating of identity politics of this kind within the region itself is probably going to extract the biggest cost from us.
I agree with you, Pratap. Thank you. And now I will turn to some questions. Fortunately, in our own discussions, we seem to have answered some of the questions that have come in. So even though we don't have much time, we're not in bad shape. I might take a couple of questions together and give them to you and keep it. This is some specific questions that have come in, actually. So one is from Agastya Bhatia, a student of mine, actually, who asks about the political strategy to passing agricultural reforms in India. What do you think they should look like, since that is a bone of contention right now? And the other one is asking about the cult of personality in politics. Paul Cohn. He lived in Chennai, saw a devotion to the DMK and ADMK party, which I thought was unique at the time, but now see it as even as dramatically happening in the US. What do you think leads people to elevate party leaders to such extent? What are the forces that are doing that? So two very different questions.
Okay, I'll try and answer them very, very briefly. So I think on the agriculture point, it's a very important question. So look, there is no question that Indian agriculture needs reforms. But any reforms have to keep, I think, three things in mind. First of all, they need to keep Indian federalism in mind. By the Indian constitutional scheme, agriculture was meant to be a state subject. And in part, it is a state subject because the requirements of different regions and different states are very, very different. I mean, agriculture in Punjab is very different from Orissa. And so the idea that a single regulatory framework can, in a sense, address all these different challenges from agriculture, I think that's just a mistake. I think you have to be just more federally creative and supple. And I think even in this reforms, if they had just one clause saying, if any one state wants to opt out of these reforms, it can, I think it would have been fine. And if other states had done well, these states would have also have joined at one point. The second thing I think to think about in reforms, and this is particularly true of Punjab, that Punjab is partly a victim of its own success, but it's also not being able to rise to the next set of challenges. Agriculture in Punjab is environmentally sustainable. I mean, there's no reason Punjab should be growing rice. Punjab has got about 100,000 crores of electricity subsidies over the last decade, which are counterproductive because they also actually lead to environmental degradation. Now, what you need is an investment in agriculture that can address these kinds of tangible problems: crop diversification, moving subsidies from subsidies to electricity to greater income support, for example, which is the most sensible way to go. Creating more different decentralized markets. I mean, our agriculture system was designed for the 1970s. When India had sort of experience with famine. Basically, two grains was all we wanted, right? Basically, rice and wheat. Now, India's single biggest challenge is chronic malnutrition. It's not the availability of grain. And yet we keep investing more and more, in a sense, in the production of grain. The new NHFS survey is showing that for the first time in the last 20 years, some of the important indicators of child nutrition are actually going down. So you actually, in a sense, need to think outside of this constrained regime of MSP for two crops in Punjab. And that requires a kind of 360-degree state engagement. I think what the state decided to do in this case was just assume that if all you did was open up the trading in the state, right, allowed private corporations in, and by the way, gave them an advantage over state mandis, somehow any of these underlying problems would be addressed. That's certainly not the case, right? And I think the tragedy of this reform is that I think it began at the wrong end of the reform cycle. You first need to talk about crop diversification, income support. Then perhaps you will be at some point, move towards thinking about different forms of procurement. But they didn't want to invest the capital in kind of engaging and doing that grand bargain on agriculture that you actually need. I think this was more to send a signal that Mr. Modi has reformist credentials. Honestly, as a lot of things this government does, it's only a half-baked measure to solve the underlying story.
The
The point about charisma is gosh. So very quickly. So look, there is no question that the kind of faith people have in Mr. Modi is absolutely unprecedented. I mean, there's no point politically denying, the fact that he's extraordinarily popular. He gets more credit than he deserves, often. And my colleague Nilanjan Sarkar has this phrase called politics of Vishwas, politics of faith, which he has actually tried to quantify through electoral data in some ways, where people's beliefs get formed because of their investment in a leader, not the other way around, in some senses. And you saw that phenomenon with Trump, right? I mean, if Trump says, the sun is rising, supporters say the sun is, in a sense, rising. You're very prescient, you're very astute in seeing the analogies with Tamil Nadu politics. In fact, I actually think a lot of the BJP's political repertoire is things we were used to at the state level, right? Combination of cinematic, charismatic leaders with forms of ethnic mobilization now being transposed onto in a new identity. You have to give Mr. Modi, he's politically astute. He is an extraordinary communicator. I know it's anathema in left and center circles to even say this. I mean, if you actually look at, in a sense, the grammar of his political articulation, in a sense, quite extraordinary. And he has managed to produce the kind of identification that is unprecedented. Now, what makes them attractive? There are two hypotheses on this, and I just want to put both of them out. So one is that, look, that people see no alternative. I mean, frankly, there's a kind of conception that every other political leader seems so narcissistic and self-obsessed in a petty kind of way. Mr. Modi can be narcissistic, but there's a kind of perverse grandeur about that narcissism. So there's an aesthetic of that politics. But there's also, I think, a certain kind of nihilistic attraction, particularly in elites, right? Where the very fact that he can flout, any normal convention, be in a sense the epitome of sort of freedom. We have to, in a sense, I think, unpack the cultural politics behind this. I think a lot more seriously, that in part what people expect from leaders is precisely, right, what many of us find objectionable to them. Even lying is seen as an expression of freedom, right? Oh, look, he's such a great leader, right? He's not even constrained by 2 + 2 = 4 anymore, right? There's an extraordinary, I think, cultural nihilism in parts of our elites, I think in both countries, in the United States and India, that we have not fully unpacked.
Well put. We are literally out of time. However, if you don't mind, maybe a couple more minutes, because there's one question from somebody in the State Department, very specific. How important do you think the upcoming election in Bengal, which has been resistant to the BJP type politics, to the BJP's larger political ambitions? Just very briefly.
It's very important. It's already a very violent election, and it's likely to continue to be a violent election. The BJP is gaining ground. Whether they will eventually win I'm not sure yet. I mean, I haven't been able to kind of, but it will be an absolute triumph for the BJP if they win. Partly because of its symbolic value. It's always been in the left and kind of TMC. But partly it'll actually seal their credentials of being a national party. It also then gives them more headroom, right? If you have a state like Bengal and you can acquire a footprint in a state like Andhra Pradesh, even if you lose a couple of other states. So this election is absolutely vital for the BJP. A win would certainly, I think, cap their ambitions. A minor loss would still be a kind of victory for them, so long as they can establish that they are now a significant force in West Bengal.
Pratap, I'm going to give you literally 30 seconds to say what, in your view, is perhaps one or two bright lights, optimistic trends that you can see going forward on Indian democracy if you are forced to do that?
No, so I think I do think it is a time of immense questioning for young people. I think the nature of political conversation is quite sophisticated in the younger generation, and they're asking searching questions. I think they're at a bit of a loss on how to politically channelize. I think some of the frustrations they're feeling. The second trend line, which is you also have significant social shifts happening. So, for example, one thing we haven't talked about a lot is what role is gender going to play in Indian politics? Right now, I think there is the view that actually women have supported the BJP more, partly because Mr. Modi has been very astute in reaching out to them in all kinds of ways, actually, which are. But as some of the underlying social liberalization that actually comes with it proceeds, it's going to make the BJP's capacity to engage in a reactionary politics. There's going to be a different kind of social pressure on it. So that's put. But as I said, it's early days to figure out how these forces are going to express themselves politically.
Both of us sitting in the universities, this is good news to hear. And Pratap, I'm going to bring this to a close now, but let me say what a phenomenal event it's been. Wonderful from you, and there's so much more that we could go on. And I want to thank the audience for their patience and with me for not getting to all the questions, but I think you've had a riveting discussion in any case. So we will be sending out a recording of this event next week. And meanwhile, stay tuned. Pratap, I hope we can meet up in person soon.
Thank you so much. And thank you to all the participants. It's a great privilege. Thank you.
Bye-bye then.
Bye. Bye.